Well now, my friend. Well now. I would say they were way off course.
Get in! Get in!
What's happening? What's happening?
I mean, they're shooting at everybody!
Who are they?
Come on, man, just relax. Robert. Oh my God.
For those of you not familiar, Red Dawn is a movie released in 1984 which depicts a non-nuclear World War III invasion of the US by communist forces led by Russia. The story centres around a small gang of high school kid protagonists who escape to the Rocky Mountains and gradually become freedom fighters. The film is unique, not just because of its very unusual war plot, but also because it's a brat pack war movie. Patrick Swayze, Charlie Sheen, Jennifer Grey, C. Thomas Howell. These are some of the familiar actors of the time who we would typically expect to see in teenage fantasy and comedy movies from the 80s, such as Dirty Dancing, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, The Breakfast Club, those kinds of movies. But here they are killing communist invaders and frequently getting killed themselves. The idea of a brat pack war movie is pretty awesome in itself, very original. However, Red Dawn isn't a happy-go-lucky movie. In fact, it's really dark, but it does have commercial action elements that conflict with the more serious World War III premise. Now, most official movie critics despised this movie, and still do, mostly for ideological reasons, which we'll get into throughout this video because it's quite a complex matter. But the film was successful anyway, making back at least twice its budget. It was very popular as a video rental as well. These days the film is viewed as harshly by paid mainstream critics as when it was released, but much to their annoyance, Red Dawn has been slowly developing a little bit of a cult following over the years. I've discovered in recent viewings and in reading the original script that Red Dawn is one of the most misunderstood movies of all time. So this video is going to delve very deep into the film's symbolic structure in a way that I've not seen in any other reviews. But first let me tell you about my personal experience of the movie, which has gone through 3 distinct phases spanning over 35 years since it was released. It's important that I outline this so that you know why I've made this video. I was living in Canada at the time Red Dawn was released in 1984, and so I was able to see the film on the cinema when I was about 11 years old. That's right, this movie, which has been stupidly cited by many as the most violent movie ever made, I saw it on the cinema when I was a kid. And as a kid I really enjoyed it. I wasn't politically minded, nor did I even think of the film as being something likely to happen in the real world. I just enjoyed it as a sort of action, adventure, war film, but it also opened my young eyes to some dark aspects of war and society that I hadn't been exposed to before. The teenagers fighting Russians storyline felt like action fantasy, which I liked.
Matt, RPG!
But the scenes of the Russian officers debating the politics and logistics of this fictional future war, those felt quite a bit more realistic. Not that I knew anything about war strategy, of course, especially at that young age. I loved this film as a kid, and so did a lot of my friends and family, and we watched it a lot of times on video, and it didn't turn us into militarists or racists or neo-Nazis. Jump ahead by 25 years or so, and I watched the film again in about 2010, this time in my late 30s. Having learned a lot about politics and psychology and filmmaking during the interim, now Red Dawn seemed like a silly Cold War propaganda movie. However, I was at this point particularly compromised by my hatred of the warmongering, imperialist, pro-police state Bush administration. I'd also learned from extensive reading about how Western corporatists and warmongers, a lot of them operating on Wall Street, had covertly supported the rise of both the Nazis and the Soviet communists, even supplying arms, funds and technology to them, thus helping both regimes to kill millions globally. At the time, this made me very anti-US establishment, so through that lens I was disappointed in my rewatch of Red Dawn, and my estimation of the film went right down the pan. I also took the presence of huge tanks and Russian war helicopter props as being evidence of US military involvement in the making of Red Dawn. How else would the filmmakers acquire such military props? I'll come back to that later though, because it turns out that these aren't the real deal, they're actually fake, which is pretty awesome and impressive in itself. We'll come back to that in detail later. Anyway, that negative viewing of Red Dawn for me was in about 2010, and this was just a couple of years before the abysmally bad remake of Red Dawn floated to the surface in 2012. But at the same time, there was still something entertaining and gripping about the original Red Dawn that conflicted with my sudden negative reassessment. And I partially put this down to, oh, I must have just enjoyed this when I was a kid, so it's a little bit of nostalgia. But at the same time, there's lots of other movies that I loved as a kid which I now really don't like. Emotionally, Red Dawn still felt very much stronger than your typical war movie, even with me seeing it as Cold War propaganda. There's some very good actors in it playing decent roles. There is some very cheesy dialogue in places, but also lots of great one-liners. And I don't mean snappy 80s jokes, I'm talking about the serious dialogue scenes. Some of them are quite well written and acted.
He's not a troublemaker.
Then who is?
Well, let's just say it runs in some of the families.
Well, this community is indeed fortunate to have a shepherd like him.
National context aside, there's a very dark emotional journey for most of the characters, and the feeling of the horrors of war is certainly there. The pacing is very good, squeezing a lot of story into just over 2 hours. The speeches from characters are condensed as they should be in a commercial movie, and the musical score by Basil Poledouris is fucking awesome. No 80s pop or rock songs as you'd expect in a film aimed at youth, just a very appropriate orchestral score that captures the various moods as required, ranging from deep sadness to incoming doom to the glories of a battle won. So in that viewing around 2010, I rationalised away my positive feelings for the film, categorising Red Dawn as very entertaining Cold War propaganda, and I left it at that with no intention to ever watch or think about the film again. In fact, the only further interest I had was that perhaps I could produce a video about the film's Cold War propaganda qualities. But jump ahead again by 10 years to the recent weeks of early 2020, which is 36 years after Red Dawn's release, and we have the global coronavirus panic invading our Western comfort zones like an army of microbe-sized commies. Like everybody else, I've found both the reported spread of this virus and our social and government reaction to it to be fascinating and a bit scary. Where is all this headed, and what do the reactions say about us and our governments? Being a guy who writes a lot about movies, the corona pandemic got me thinking about movies with virus-related themes, like The Thing and The Andromeda Strain. But also the sudden switch of social psychology into a kind of mass prepper culture, which until recently was mostly considered right-wing. Now millions are developing a prepper attitude with so-called left and right-wingers stocking up on food and other essentials, each trying to look out for number one, even if it means emptying the shelves so that old and otherwise vulnerable people might have to go without. So much for social responsibility. I already knew that political ideologies are bullshit anyway, and that when people are faced with situations where they don't feel like they can count on some political or military or police authority to protect them, most of them drop their supposed ideals and do what's natural. They try to survive, and they prioritise themselves and their personal loved ones over everyone else. And I'm not claiming to be any different either. This corona shopping panic reminded me of a fast-paced prepper scene at the beginning of Red Dawn. When the teenagers are escaping their Soviet-occupied town, they quickly stock up and head for the mountains. And there's a classic line that always stood out in this film to begin with.
Somebody get some lanterns.
38 special.
Grab some toilet
Get
paper.
that 12
I
gauge.
ain't gonna use no leaves. Hey,
Take
grab the
22.
cookies. Somebody
Save a lot of that.
Grab some toilet paper. I thought how ironic that this film gets viewed as a right-wing prepper fantasy by some, and yet a simple government lockdown because of a virus has them scrambling for toilet paper too. So being stuck in the lockdown like everybody else these last few weeks, one night I thought, let's watch some cheesy Red Dawn escapism. There's plenty of other unrealistic war movies that I still love to this day, like The Dirty Dozen, the Rambo movies, and so on. In fact, most war movies are very unrealistic if you pay attention. So if I can still enjoy those movies, then why not just enjoy Red Dawn on that level as a cheesy escapist action war flick and just forget about the politics? But at the same time, I decided to observe Red Dawn for some potentially interesting aspects of prepper psychology that might be relevant to the current coronavirus pandemic. So I went through my third phase of watching Red Dawn, this time watching it with all my political judgments and the expectations of realism shoved temporarily aside, and you know what, this time it was a very, very enjoyable rewatch. But also my receptivity to the prepper themes opened me up to several other aspects of the film that I wasn't aware of around 2010. In fact, some of the themes were things that I think I'd felt the presence of when I watched the movie as a kid, because my young mind wasn't compromised by silly ideological delusions or any specific love or hatred of the US or the Soviet Union. Until recently, I also hadn't logically connected the simple fact that John Milius, who wrote and directed Red Dawn, also wrote the original script for Apocalypse Now, which he did a great job on. Director Francis Coppola has been very open about the fact that most of Apocalypse Now's best and most grandiose ideas, and a lot of the best one-liners, were conceived and written by John Milius. And yet, Apocalypse Now is loved by those who identify as left-wing because it portrays war as a chaotic mess rather than being justified by patriotism or any other stupid ideological cause. All of this was in Milius's original script, and he certainly had been influenced by the excellent Dr. Strangelove, a movie that achieves that rare feat of sidestepping idiotic ideological perceptions such as left-wing versus right-wing, capitalist versus socialist, and all the rest of it. Milius's script for Apocalypse Now ends with a parody battle scene in which Colonel Kurtz and his followers all sacrifice themselves in a big, stupid, glorious ground battle against the VC. It's definitely written for comical parody effect, but Coppola went in a very different direction in the movie version. But my main point with Apocalypse Now is this. How could John Milius write that script in the late 1970s and less than 10 years later make a movie which a reviewer for The Independent has rhetorically called the most right-wing commercial hit ever? It didn't make sense. In fact, while Apocalypse Now was Milius's own script, written from scratch, Red Dawn was actually written by Kevin Reynolds as a script called 10 Soldiers. Milius did a bit of a rewrite, but it certainly wasn't his own original story. Most of the changes he made to the script were for the better, such as reducing the number of central characters and combining some scenes to avoid repetition, but most of the stuff that critics object to in the finished movie was already in the Reynolds script before Milius rewrote it. And I'd place a major bet that most of the ideological haters of Red Dawn have never even glanced through the original script. So I decided to go read the critical reviews of Red Dawn, both from when it was released and the various retro reviews since, to find out whether the deeper complexities and themes of this movie have been acknowledged or even noticed at all. The vast majority of reviews basically accuse Red Dawn of being right-wing propaganda and of being unrealistic. Some reviewers go so far as to try and frame everyone who even remotely likes this film as being right-wing. See Renegade Cuts one-dimensional video as an example of that, and I will be going into detail about his review later towards the end of this video. Personally, I don't buy into left or right politics, as I think there's good and bad on both sides. In fact, I'm going to be making some arguments in this video as to why people who identify as left-wing should actually embrace Red Dawn. That's right. For example, the movie underhandedly equates the teenage Wolverine freedom fighters with Native Americans resisting colonialism. Nothing right-wing about that, is there? The original script by Kevin Reynolds proves this beyond a doubt, and once you're aware of it, it flies in the face of the patriotic right-wing assumptions by certain critics. And that's not the only example. We'll be getting into a lot of that stuff later. But for the sake of being thorough and as unbiased as I can, I'll now present a negative critique of Red Dawn that is partially from my own observations and partially a series of points plucked from existing negatively biased reviews that are already out there. Bear with me here as I'm going to go on a righteous rant against Red Dawn just to show how easy it is to distort this movie through an ideologically biased lens. For those of you who already like Red Dawn, you don't need to go posting opposition to my negative critique in the comments section below, because I'm going to be making a lot of arguments against my own negative critique later in this video. Okay, so just bear with me. Are you ready? Here we go. This film certainly portrays the Soviet invaders and their Cuban and Mexican communist allies in a very bad light, executing civilians by firing squad, attacking a school full of teenagers who hadn't even tried to resist the occupation until they were fired upon. The soldiers could have easily just rounded up these kids, pointing guns at them, and there would be no fight. Sure, the director wanted to just get the story going without wasting screen time and to establish the danger of the invasion, but that's a poor excuse for such blatant demonization of the enemy. There's the cold and hardened faces of some of the military high command. The old one here looks and sounds like Dracula. There are some allusions to one or both of the young girl characters having been raped by occupation soldiers.
Sons of bitches tried having their way with them.
And one of them is hit on and hassled by Russian soldiers in different scenes.
Miss, maybe you speak at me for a minute.
I'll be right back, okay?
You bring girlfriend?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be right here. Bye.
This guy who hits on her gets blown up by a bomb that she planted. I think it's implying that he deserved it. In a big action montage with victoriously bombastic music, the Soviets are seen being shot and blown up, with no blood or screaming injured being shown. Just instant deaths to glorious music. And I think this is probably the most cringeworthy sequence of the whole movie, and the glorious murder music is unintentionally paralleled by the Russians playing the Soviet Union anthem as they prepare coffins for their own dead right before they execute the families and friends of the teen rebels. So much for the glory of killing for either side. In another unrealistic battle scene, the Wolverines take out a re-education camp, freeing the prisoners but somehow managing not to kill any of them in the crossfire. Again, big glorious music and an explosion that's shown twice. Is this a war movie or an episode of the A-Team? Here, two characters take seconds to die from torso wounds that would likely take hours or days to kill them, though that is typical of almost all war movies. And the whole idea that these teenagers, of which there are only about 8 of them in all, could mount raid after raid after raid against a trained and well-armed invading force, only finally conceding a casualty of their own after months of battles, I don't think so. They're taking on dozens of enemies in some scenes, often with the enemy having military battle tanks. Even a crack squad of Russian commandos is easily slaughtered by these teenagers in a forest. But how did the rebel kids even know that they were coming? Eventually the protagonists do start dying and most of them are killed by the end of the movie, but even then, just 2 of them are able to wage a hell of a battle against the Soviet enemy in their own well-secured base. For some reason, lead rebel Jed has an opportunity to kill his Russian officer opponent, but here he is just walking out in the open where his footsteps in the snow could be heard. He announces his presence and then gets shot.
You lose.
That was stupid. What was the point of that? Did he want to die here or what? On the larger scale, there's the unlikely premise of a Soviet ground invasion of the US. The US has a huge military force backed by more military technology than any other country in the world, and it's a nuclear power, so any country mounting such an invasion has to contend with nuclear retaliation. The film tries to get around this with the unlikely scenario that the US nuclear response is rendered inoperative during the first phase of the attack, both by infiltrators at SAC command bases and by a handful of swift nuke strikes on key US high command locations, such as Washington. This is known as a decapitation attack. The film very quickly breezes over all this, but it's explained in a bit more detail in the original script. The SAC Command infiltrators are cited as having travelled in illegally from Mexico, which raises another critical point of view that we can adopt, that Red Dawn is an underhandedly racist film.
You don't understand. They know who all of you are. They're looking for you.
Who?
The KGB.
The Russians?
And the Cubans.
Cubans.
Oh my god, the Cubans! The rebel American teenagers are virtually all white. There is a token Hispanic kid among them, insultingly nicknamed Aardvark, who shouts their name from a cliff top. But he's the least fleshed out character and the first of them to be killed. Wolverines is the name of their school football team, by the way. So has killing Russians just become like a sport? Aardvark was probably put in the story to offset any accusations of racism regarding Mexican and Cuban troops assisting the Soviets in their invasion. But any tragedy associated with Aardvark's death is dampened by the fact that Tanner, a crashed air pilot who joined their team, dies in the same scene. He's a character we got to know better and care more about, and the main character among the occupying force is a Cuban officer named Bella who orders executions of civilians. Cuban guy ordering executions of mostly white people. Sure, Aardvark's dad is among them, but still, I see racism. The film can also be viewed with some validity as a gun enthusiast's wet dream. It presents a scenario in which civilians having access to firearms conveniently becomes not only beneficial but necessary. One guy, shot dead by Russian troops, has a pro-gun sign in the back of his truck. And Jed talks about surviving in the mountains.
We can hunt, we can fish, we can stay up here a long, long time.
We see the hunting but not the fishing, because you don't shoot fish, partner. And there are the heads of hunted animals on the walls of this old guy's house. Gun enthusiast's wet dream. At the grand scale of the story, the film promoted to the public the paranoid view that the Soviet Union might actually invade the US if it had half the chance. Combined with the racial themes and the portrayal of Cubans and Americans among the invading force, Red Dawn is a xenophobic movie. This goes hand in hand with the patriotic, Save America, Wave the Flag, US against the world framing of the film, as depicted by the ridiculous opening captions. The United States stands alone. Even though later in the film it's stated that the British and the Chinese are on America's side, while Europe sits it out, but no mention of Australia, Canada, or any other countries that wouldn't want to be the next in the communist firing line for world takeover. Even at the micro level, we can pick away at this movie with a critical eye. When the Soviets execute the family and friends of the resistance fighters, how is it that a couple of the rebels just happen to be there to see it? Are they in the habit of just hanging around near hordes of enemies where they might get caught, or were they sent written invitations to this party? Yeah, okay, it serves the emotional narrative to have at least one of the rebels see the executions, so I suppose we'll have to let that one go, but it is a plot hole. Killing nature's beautiful creatures with guns is promoted with a character drinking the blood of a deer on the stupid premise that it will magically transform him into a warrior. And when he's told here that there'll be something different about you always, suddenly the call of a hawk or some other predatory bird is heard above.
His blood is yours. You know, my dad said that once you do that, there's going to be something different about you. Always.
But anyway, why not drink the blood of a Russian soldier instead? Maybe the alcohol content would be too high for Americans. Or how about the presentation of the character Daryl, who is an intellectual leader at school? He is put in his place by a jock who seems to know little more than football and hunting.
You wanna go so bad here, haul ass, take your shit.
Daryl later becomes the one who betrays the group and is executed for it. Is this an anti-intellectual movie? In fact, Daryl's story arc includes more leaps of logic in the plot. If Daryl had been captured and had revealed where the rebels were, then why send him back to the rebels, which risked him telling that their position had been compromised? And the bug he was apparently made to swallow, what if he crapped it out? Elsewhere, the behaviour of Russian soldiers makes little sense. Here, our heroes are escaping in a truck, but there are dozens of soldiers on the street. Instead of firing at the truck, they all swarm upon Aardvark's dad like a pack of wolves, at least half a dozen armed soldiers to restrain one unarmed civilian. After Tony lets her bag be taken and the Russians don't check inside but conveniently put it in the tank where it explodes, instead of just shooting her, they chase her with knives. A very convenient setup for this. Where did she get the bike, by the way? Another flaw in this film is that as the Wolverines mount their raids, in some cases freeing prisoners from the communists, their group size stays the same. Here they are handing out guns, but why is it no one who they save joins their ranks? Is it just because the filmmakers wanted to concentrate on a small group of young central characters?
They brought their kids. Said they didn't have food enough to feed them through the winter. They want to give them to you, Jed.
This is enough, Mr. Mason. I don't want any more.
How dare they? How do these kids figure out how to use RPGs and various rifles? If there were instruction manuals, they'd be in Russian. When the Russians left behind food in a bait trap, wasn't it obvious it was a trap? Why were the vehicles stopped? And why not poison the food? The Soviet military intelligence didn't think to do that. And why didn't this guy hide in some bushes or a rock crevice, wait until one of the choppers had landed, and then open fire on them? AK-47 against a flying war chopper, don't be stupid. And on the leaps of logic go. So given all these plot holes and all this defending your country with guns, underhanded racism, demonising of other countries and demonising communism, surely Red Dawn is just a piece of ridiculous, unrealistic, right-wing propaganda aimed at subverting American youth toward gun ownership and nationalism, etc., etc. Okay, wake up, wake up. Some of that lengthy negative critique I've just given involved valid points and some of it was tongue-in-cheek. But on the whole, I've shown just how easy it is to cherry-pick certain aspects of the movie and ignore others in order to present an ideological view of the film and to simply just portray the film as being completely horrible. There are some negative critiques of the film that I've left out because I'll be specifically rebutting them later. But next, I'm going to go into the positive aspects of the movie that seem to have been missed almost universally, at least by the critics anyway. And I'm going to point out the contradictions in how the film has been perceived. But first, a quick disclaimer for any viewers who are paranoid about neo-Nazis lurking on every street corner and in every dark corner of YouTube. Personally, I've never been into Holocaust denial. I've never joined a fascist or communist political party, as I've got no time for either. I'm not an ethno-nationalist, although I'm okay with a small amount of civic nationalism, which is the version that cares about laws and customs but not race. I've never been charged or prosecuted with a hate crime of any kind. I've never fired a gun in my life, probably because I live in the UK. I have a strong preference for avoiding war. I much prefer democracy to left or right-wing variations of elitism. I don't argue that immigrants are evil or should be mass deported, though I'm willing to acknowledge and talk about key cultural behavioural differences that are causing problems, such as the gang rape epidemic here in the UK. I don't support racial segregation or religious persecution, but I'm not religious myself either. I don't own any national flags. You won't find a big Union Jack adorning the walls of my house or office, though even if I did, it wouldn't be evidence of me being a dangerous person. I'm not particularly pro-American, though I certainly in some ways prefer it to the UK on a cultural level, being that you Americans are much more open and have a can-do attitude compared to the stiff upper lip aspects of British society, which I'm not keen on. And I've also made studies of Starship Troopers and Dr. Strangelove that strongly criticise aspects of the US establishment and their foreign policy. I don't long for a return to British colonialism, nor do I have any particular affection for the royal family here. There's very little argument that can be made for pegging me as just being an intellectually compromised left or right-winger, because I actually hold a mix of opinions that fall on both sides of the spectrum, as any free-thinking person should. Now that's me, but what about writer-director John Milius, because he is a major factor in how this film is perceived. A lot of people see the name John Milius and they automatically just go, that must be a fascist movie. His persona is perceived by his haters as being a gun-crazed, pro-war, fascist loony, and he's certainly much more interested in guns and war than I am. Undoubtedly, this has been a source for rhetorical opposition to Red Dawn. It's a Milius film, so it must be a promotion of right-wing fascism. Well, as I've already mentioned, Milius wrote the original script for Apocalypse Now, which was even more anti-war and anti-US imperialism than the finished movie is. So this proves that Milius's worldview doesn't conveniently fit along the stupid left-right political spectrum. The guy is full of contradictions, and part of this is because he had a fiery sense of humour. He loved to troll people by making controversial statements and by doing crazy things that got him a reputation as a loose cannon. And remember that most of that occurred before the internet existed. People used to go around saying and doing crazy shit back then that they wouldn't do now because now they're afraid of social media, that someone's going to post something about them. The excellent documentary Milius outlines how, going right back to his youth, he always positioned himself as an outsider to whatever the prevailing consensus was. He didn't start fistfights or shoot people to my knowledge, but he would say inflammatory things, often with a cheeky grin, or show people handguns. Though I don't know whether these handguns were typically loaded or not. There are rumours of him pointing guns at executives, but to my knowledge he was never charged with such an offence. That seems pretty surprising. So maybe these are exaggerated stories or something? I don't know. Spielberg, Lucas and Coppola have all attested to the fact that when they were making their blockbuster movies and had scripting problems, they frequently would consult Milius and ask him for the favour of writing them some decent script changes or chunks of dialogue, and Milius would then quickly deliver the goods, his additions often resulting in the most memorable scenes and one-liners in the finished movies. Milius was a fantastic writer because he was daring and he was willing to make bold, controversial statements that would get people thinking and debating. Even if he was in the wrong, at least his films got people talking. When people reacted to him as if he was a fascist, instead of going into defensive mode or at least providing calm counter-arguments, he would often embrace their view of him and say things to further inflame their one-dimensional view. He loved to troll people. And to this day, the humorless critics who basically perceive him to be a closet Nazi not only haven't got the joke yet, but they use his trolling comments to try and persuade others of their view of the man. To this effect, Milius was arguably the main architect of his own negative portrayal by his critics. I mean, some of the things he said or is reported to have said, I would find vile if I thought they were all completely honest. For example, allegedly saying he wanted to drop napalm on children. That's a troll statement if ever there was one. But either way, he still can't just be pegged into an ideological corner. He has talked about his severe dislike of corporatism, for example, and his love of movies like Dr. Strangelove, one of the greatest anti-war, anti-ideological bullshit movies ever released. Most of us, including Milius, are a contradictory mix of good and bad traits, but ultimately it's our actions that count. He may have liked guns, but it doesn't mean he shot people. Just like a person who trains in boxing or martial arts doesn't necessarily mean that they go around beating people up in the streets or domestically beating their families. If you find out that Milius actually killed or hurt people, then do let me know, because as far as I can tell, he was just a rebellious and humorous guy who loved to challenge convention and get people thinking. He may have been contrarian to a fault, but the world needs to have contrarians in place now and then, because from time to time they do teach us things. Okay, so on with my positive reassessment of Red Dawn itself. I'll start with one of the most crucial hidden themes. The Soviet-led communist invaders in this movie are symbolic of multiple oppressive and expansionist regimes throughout history. There are some obvious clues in the film, usually in the form of verbal references to other wars. Here, Bella talks in Russian about having seen dead troops in other war-torn countries, thus drawing a parallel between the Wolverine rebels and rebel forces in other wars. Here, Bella and his commanding officer discuss their scenario. The old guy compares the Wolverines with the rebels in Afghanistan, and Bella cites a Vietnam War comparison, with the Wolverines equivalent to the Viet Cong fighting against the US, ironically. In this scene, the rocky landscape and how the rebel kids are dressed reminded me of Afghan rebels fighting against the Soviet invasion of their country. The script says that Jed is bundled in white for this scene. That's quite specific, isn't it? The script also says that the commando unit brought in to hunt down the Wolverines were the finest anti-partisan unit in Afghanistan. And there's an additional scripted character who's not in the film, a Russian sniper woman who has 60 kills in Afghanistan and 80 in Poland. So, lots of references to other wars in other countries, especially Afghanistan. One of the strongest parallels is that the Wolverines are equated to Native Americans. 3 Russians show up near the rebels' mountain camp for a bit of sightseeing, and one of them tries to translate a forestry sign, but he misinterprets it as the story of a glorious battle between Native Americans and their colonial opponents. The same guy then finds one of the Wolverines' arrows and mistakes it for a genuine Indian arrow. All this foreshadows the battle that they are about to have with the Wolverines, in which the 3 Russians are the colonialists and the Wolverines are the Indians. The script includes plenty more examples of this metaphor. Bows and arrows continue to be used in subsequent battle scenes. The teenagers grow their hair long and tie it back so that they look like Indians. They also befriend some actual Indians in the mountains who give them supplies from time to time. Their school teacher at the beginning talks about the Native American resistance to colonialists and their technology, but in the film this is changed to the story of Genghis Khan's murderous rampage across Asia. But getting back to the Native American parallel, the character Robert, who has become the most brutalized killer of the lot, in the script he begins cutting the scalps from dead Russians. I think the script overdoes the Indian comparisons though, so I'm glad Milius discarded most of it. The scene where the Russians find the arrow is a strong enough clue, however Milius added in the scene in which Robert drinks the blood of his first animal kill. Some have said the scene refers to certain Native American tribes doing the same, but there seems to be some debate over this. Apparently it's a tradition among modern day hunters in the South anyway. Considering these comparisons with other freedom fighter groups, Red Dawn isn't just a one-dimensional America-only view. It's about American civilians protecting their way of life, but it's also a history lesson about freedom fighters versus invading forces across the globe. But perhaps the most important example of these historical parallels is that the depiction of town life under communist rule has overtones of a Nazi occupation. They burn the people's books, which has happened under many regimes, but the Nazis are very famous for it. And even when I was a kid, the way these officers were dressed and their propaganda reminded me of Nazis when I'd seen them in other war movies. The theme is further verified in the script. The town citizens have to carry ID cards under the occupation. The commandos brought in to fight the Wolverines are specifically likened to SS troops in World War II, while another scene has Russian soldiers eating at McDonald's with the description, quote, "At the tables below, uniformed officers enjoy burgers in the same spirit as Germans at a 1940 Paris cafe," end quote. In the script and film, when one of the Russian soldiers is captured, he's asked if he speaks German.
Sprechen Sie Deutsch?
So what if he does? You don't.
But at no other point in the story is it implied that the invading force involves Germans. In fact, the captions at the start of the movie say that the Green Party has been elected in Germany, leading to nuclear disarmament. And here's another one. When the boys listen to an American radio broadcast from the safe zone, there's a piece of message coding. Have a listen.
Right now, I got a few words for some of our brothers and sisters in the occupied zone. The chair is against the wall. The chair is against the wall. John has a long mustache. John has a long mustache. It's 12 o'clock, Americans, another day.
This is a callback to a radio broadcast that was sent from Britain to Nazi-occupied France in World War II. The specific phrase, "Jean has a long moustache," was part of their broadcast codes and was also shown in the World War II movie The Longest Day. Oh, and by the way, that detail, that wasn't in the original script. John Milius added that. So once again, the communist occupation of the US in this movie is deliberately in parallel with Nazis occupying countries in Europe in World War II. For all you folks out there who thought this movie was pro-fascist, the anti-Nazi paradigm was there in this movie all along, but you missed it. Of course, it would be easy to accidentally draw parallels between the Nazis and Soviet communists anyway. Despite being labelled as the opposite ends of the bullshit political spectrum, fascism and communism in practice are incredibly similar to each other. The Nazis and Soviet communists each murdered millions, both used forms of socialism to acquire and consolidate power. That's right, National Socialism for the Nazis and International Socialism for the communists. Both had world power plans and tried to carry them out, and in both instances, national pride was involved. The Soviets loved their flag and anthem too. We've all heard again and again about the genocide under the Nazis, but we don't hear so much about the mass executions of Russian farmers who were either killed or put in work camps because they were perceived to be parasitic capitalists. The resulting decimation of the farm industry led to mass starvation in Russia. Or how about Pol Pot's communist regime in Cambodia and its mass murder of a quarter of its own country's population? Cambodia even had forced racial segregation and racial genocide under communist rule. That's right, racism exists on the left too. Over in the Soviet Union, Stalin ordered the incarceration of Jewish doctors to be sent off to work camps, and this was after the concentration camps of the Nazi regime had already been liberated. Go read about the doctor's plot if you don't believe me. Stalin believed there was a Jewish conspiracy among doctors to kill top-ranking members of the Communist Party. Actually, that raises a very important parallel between communists and fascists that tends to go unnoticed. I've never heard it mentioned anywhere. The hatred of Jews by Stalin's regime and by the Nazis were both driven by the perception of Jews as dangerous economic competitors in their own backyard. They both perceived Jews as tending to get rich and powerful and therefore made them targets for suppression. At the same time, both regimes would happily ally with other races who they felt were in line with their own agendas. So the Nazis actually referred to races and nations who cooperated with their plans as, quote, honorary Aryans, end quote. Seriously, this is what they called their Japanese allies. Left versus right, my arse. The expressed ideological differences between the Nazis and the Soviet communists were cosmetic. In practice, it's the same mass murderous result. So one thing Red Dawn does successfully, which left and right-wing identifiers should embrace, is it takes the atrocities of murderous invading regimes past and present and ports them into a modern-day context for youthful Western audiences to see. A very important history lesson. The fact that the Soviet Union is cast as the enemy in the literal sense in this story is largely incidental, hence the film doesn't get much into the ideological rantings of communism versus capitalism. In fact, Tanner's simplistic explanation of war motives is more akin to reality than the usual ideological rhetoric.
What started it?
I don't know, two toughest kids on the block, I guess. Sooner or later, they're gonna fight.
That's simple.
Maybe somebody just forgot what it was like.
And that's true, ideologies are bullshit. Most wars are basically competing power bureaucracies pitting their populations against each other for geographical domination. So once again we have an important and rare truth in Red Dawn. But to use any other country as a fictional invader of America in the 80s would be far less plausible. The crappy Red Dawn remake had China cast as the invader, but when this was complained about by the media, they changed it to a North Korean invasion, which was then laughed off for its absurdity. The original Red Dawn more successfully puts across the point that we may well have become too complacent in our sense of safety in the West. Empires rise and fall, and eventually the US will too. And if invasion does come, by its nature, it's likely to be done by surprise. It's interesting and ironic that this basic message of let's not forget the history of military invasions and occupations is attacked far less by paid film critics when it's presented in the realm of science fiction. The TV series V came out around the same time as Red Dawn. It featured alien invaders who had a logo variation on the swastika, but who also dressed in red, so maybe a communist invader overtone there. The invaders take over and occupy Earth, and they have curfews and propaganda and all the rest of it, with an old Jewish character likening the situation to Nazi occupation just to make the parallel really obvious. Throughout the series, American civilians, like in Red Dawn, form a rebellion to fight back against the invaders, and they end up saving the entire Earth. They do a lot of prepping, and they do a lot of gunfiring. V ended up being the most successful TV series ever at the time it was aired. It was huge, but essentially it told a similar invasion story to Red Dawn. Both carry a never forget message about the atrocities of history. The messages of V and Red Dawn are basically the same. History's lessons of war tend to be forgotten after a few generations. Safe society is not to be taken for granted. Liberties and family can be tragically lost. Life can take a nosedive very fast, and yet the TV show V was not branded as right-wing, pro-nationalist, pro-fascist, pro-war, or even pro-gun. And it wasn't slated as being unrealistic, even though it was way more unrealistic than Red Dawn is, featuring lizard people who pass for humans under mask suits. The same goes for movies like They Live and Independence Day. The US gets invaded, and either the government or citizens defend themselves and the critics are okay with it. And how about Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, two stories that warn of the dangers of communism? Why haven't they been labelled as right-wing? Possibly because George Orwell spoke of himself as being a socialist and wrote a lot of socialist material, and yet he wrote these books talking about the dangers of communism. Smart guy. Actually, if those books were released today, I think they probably would be branded as propaganda. And by the way, isn't it ironic that Red Dawn was released in 1984? Another weird contradiction in the critical attacks on Red Dawn is that a war movie like Saving Private Ryan exclusively shows Americans fighting in World War II, not the full range of allies. It's extremely nationalistic, with US flags on screen and salutes to the fallen brave who died for their country. It's far more violent and gun-crazed than Red Dawn is. It's a lot more pro-execution of captured enemies than Red Dawn is, and yet the critics worshipped this movie. Why were there no mainstream critic accusations of Saving Private Ryan being pro-gun, pro-war, pro-nationalist, pro-military, pro-war crime, right-wing propaganda? Of course, there's the little contradiction that it would be stupid to criticise a film as being right-wing when the protagonists are fighting against Nazis, the ultimate archetypal right-wing regime. So I wonder if Red Dawn's on-screen representation of communist regimes for the atrocities they have committed and the dangers they pose is the problem. Like, maybe it's something a lot of people don't want to hear because they're wingnuts, meaning they've long committed themselves to one side of the left versus right political model, and they want their chosen ideological wing to be the pure one. Wingnuts, go look it up. I actually made that term up myself, and I thought it was an original until I went and looked it up and was, oh, someone's beat me to it. To acknowledge that communism is dangerous is to admit that socialism doesn't have all the answers. Think about it, if this film told the exact same story, but in an alternate reality in which the Nazis invaded the US, how would the critics have taken it then? I think they would have loved it. Just as the video game series Wolfenstein is loved by critics, and it depicts Nazis as literal monsters who the player has to shoot up with guns. If a closet affection for communism is the problem for some critics, then perhaps Red Dawn is an important movie after all, presenting a truth people need to hear. Nazis and communists are to be feared and resisted in equal measure. However, there's another difference between nationalistic, pro-military movies like Saving Private Ryan and the outside contender Red Dawn. The idea that governments and the military can be trusted to stock and wield incredibly powerful weapons, but civilians can't even be trusted to have a handgun. If the US ever did get invaded by a ground force, it's certainly true that an invader would have the double headache of fighting the US military and of fighting a civilian population who are armed. Writer-director John Milius made one fiery statement about Red Dawn by saying it's not about communists, it's actually about the federal government, though he said this many, many years after the film was released. So I think he was basically trolling with that comment because there's not much in the film to support such an interpretation. But I think his jokey comment has a ring of truth to it as well. If the US population didn't have access to guns, then a dangerous warmongering regime coming into power such as the Bush administration could very easily warp into a totalitarian police state. But US civilians being so widely armed provides a certain amount of protection against such a government. It's an old hat argument on the issue of gun ownership, but it also conflicts with the assertion that gun owners are right-wing nationalists. How can they be nationalist if they distrust their own government to that level? It's yet another contradiction in the standard ideological label terminology. I also find it ironic that so many people claim to be against gun ownership, yet they watch tons of war movies and action movies in which the good guys basically kill the bad guys with guns. It's like deep down they know that violence and its weaponry means are an integral part of human life at the civilizational and personal level. And I'll add that for those who say, look, there are tens of thousands of murders in the US every year from privately owned guns, therefore the population must be disarmed. Well, the same short-term logic could be applied to the military itself. We could point out that hundreds of millions have been killed, in the last century by governments in control of national war machines. So let's have a knee-jerk reaction and completely disarm our government by taking away their military. It doesn't matter that we'd be leaving ourselves open to invasions such as that depicted in Red Dawn, because we'd be saving a smaller number of lives in the short term. No, such an ideological solution could only work if all governments disarmed at once, and I mean really disarmed. But we all know that some governments would keep a secret backup army in place for fear of other nations doing the same, or with a view to easy invasion of other countries later once they'd been disarmed. And so the short-term anti-military view is to disarm and then to spout rhetoric about being a peaceful nation, and yet quietly rely on the military of other countries to come save you if you ever do get invaded. And that has happened throughout history. And a very old school historical example of that is when you get Buddhist monks who have to, if they get attacked by, say, the Chinese or whatever, they have to go and seek refuge with another country that does have a military. Okay, so that's a lot of the political ideology stuff out the way. I actually find political rhetoric extremely boring because it's riddled with contradictions in terminology, but in reviewing Red Dawn, there was simply no way of getting around the subject. Personally, I think of Red Dawn and other films in which people's misplaced sense of safety is shattered and they have to depend on themselves and each other for survival. I think these kinds of movies are an important little reality check for all of us, and I don't just mean in reference to war. The classic movie The Matrix can even be argued to have the same emotional narrative as Red Dawn. Your reality gets shattered, you learn to adapt, you fight back against your oppressor, and you make certain sacrifices in trying to free others as well. I think we watch reality-shattering movies across all genres to remind ourselves of what we could potentially face one day in the real world. Dark subject movies are a form of psychological prepping. In fact, the premise of Red Dawn may have been more realistic than critics wanted to deal with. Like I said, Red Dawn's not a happy film. Most of the movie is swamped in fear and grief for lost loved ones. So critics may have found the concept of a communist invasion too disturbing and went into denial. The best review of Red Dawn that I've been able to find was written in 2018 by Justin Dell of the NATO Association of Canada. So that's neither a United States intelligentsia source, nor is it, to my knowledge, considered to be right-wing, conservative, or whatever other Pavlovian ideological label a denier might want to apply. Justin Dell is an academic historian who gives a fairly detailed breakdown of the World War III scenario depicted in Red Dawn, and he gives the scenario more plausibility than movie critics, who typically wouldn't know any more about war tactics than the average person in the street. Why would they? I'm no expert, which is why I'm recommending this guy's review. So if you want to read it, I'll link to it in the video description below. Justin's assessment, combined with the further explanations of the war scenario given in the Red Dawn script, is very interesting. The concept of mutual assured destruction was relied upon during the Cold War as the ultimate safety measure to prevent actual World War III. Mutual assured destruction, which has the funny acronym MAD, was the idea that neither the US or the Soviets would risk a first nuclear strike because of the inevitable outcome that the resulting counterattack would bring about their own destruction as well. Two aggressors with loaded guns pointed at each other's heads. Of course, the war tacticians of each side must have explored potential ways to neuter their opponent's strike retaliation capability. In Red Dawn, the communists have achieved this by infiltrating US SAC command bases. This is stated in the film, but in the script it's NORAD bases that have been instead sabotaged. The brief explanation in the film assumes that the viewer knows what a SAC command base is. I wouldn't have known myself except from watching the movie Dr. Strangelove. One of their roles is to launch nuclear counterattacks, or a first strike, theoretically, if ordered to do so. NORAD, on the other hand, is a defensive airspace branch that identifies threats and shoots them down. So from the Soviet Union's point of view, if you sabotage either the NORAD or SAC bases, potentially you have an undefended US airspace allowing for first strike nuclear attack. As a real-world example of how easy it can be for these defences to fail, during the September 11th World Trade Center attacks, NORAD was running a series of airspace drills across the East Coast, a huge number of drills. The drills are reported to have prevented the hijacked planes from being identified and shot down. I've always wondered how the hell the hijackers would know when a drill was due to take place that would give them an opening. Did they have infiltrators in NORAD? Who knows? There's lots of theories on 9/11, but my point is that if 19 hijackers could break through US air defences and cause the havoc at 9/11, even reportedly slamming a plane into the ground floor of the Pentagon, then isn't it feasible that a much more organised and resourceful enemy like the Soviet Union could pull off a similar but more devastating blow to the US response strike ability? Think of it this way. If 9/11 hadn't happened, but it was instead depicted in a movie, critics would have ranted about implausibility and probably accused the filmmakers of racism to boot. And the critics would have been shouting, "Oh, but we've got NORAD to protect against that." But 9/11 did happen, and it's another example of how the illusion of everlasting safety among Western citizens can be shattered in the most unexpected and immediate way. At the time of me writing this video, we have the coronavirus pandemic reaping havoc across the globe, turning people's lives upside down. And we really don't know what's around the corner with this one. We don't know if millions are going to die. We don't know if it's just being exaggerated. We don't know if certain governments are going to take the piss with it by giving themselves excessive police state powers. We just don't know what's coming with this. Or how about the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor? An attack that seemed to come out of nowhere, but was actually the result of months of careful planning and preparation by Japanese military intelligence. They flooded the Pacific airwaves with false and misleading intel for months in advance, and when the attack order came, it was coded into a radio weather report of all things. When you go read up into the deception that's gone into warfare over the past century or so, the word paranoia loses its relevance in that context. The script for Red Dawn involves some serious thought about possible attack scenarios. For example, the town of Calumet is attacked not because there's a bunch of kids there who need to go off in the mountains and become freedom fighters to generate a story, but because it sits near a pass through the Rocky Mountains that the Russians needed to strategically take. And there's this example.
First wave of the attack came in disguised as commercial and charter flights, same way they did in Afghanistan in '80. Only they were crack airborne outfits.
The script, however, said that this tactic had been used in Czechoslovakia by the Soviets, not in Afghanistan. So I went and looked it up, and I couldn't find any reports of the Afghanistan example, but the wiki page on the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia does mention that particular tactic being used. And once again, an uncomfortable similarity to 9/11, the use of commercial planes to sneakily deliver destruction and chaos. So the movie had this way before 9/11 happened. Going back to Justin Dell's review of Red Dawn for the NATO Association of Canada, I emailed him to ask if either side of the Cold War had ever planned, anticipated, or even attempted the aforementioned counter-strike neutralization tactics. To my pleasant surprise, it turned out that Justin was already a subscriber to my YouTube channel, and so he was familiar with my work too. And he gave a lengthy response which included an outline of the case of Robert Hansen, who I'd never heard of before. Hansen was an FBI agent working in counter-espionage, but he had taken it upon himself to anonymously sell to the Soviet Union details of the US plans for continuance of government in the event of a decapitation strike by the Soviets. He revealed America's backup plan. So Hansen's info could potentially allow the Soviets to launch a decapitation attack against the US and annihilate their backup government infrastructure at the same time. Hansen began his information leaking activities in 1979, and he continued them on and off until he was caught in 2001. 22 years he was at it. And he was selling this vital information to the Soviets while the blindfolded critics were lambasting Red Dawn's premise as right-wing paranoia and propaganda. Hansen wasn't the only example of this kind of information leak either. Aldrich Armes was leaking CIA information at the same time as Hansen and was caught in 1994. In fact, some of their information leaks overlapped with each other, so the Soviets were getting a good idea from the two of them that their information was reliable. And this is what a bastard Hansen was. He actually revealed the names of US operatives working in the Soviet Union who were then executed by the Soviet Union. Okay folks, time for a commercial break here. For those of you who are not aware, over at my website, which is collativelearning.com, I've got a ton of videos and articles and audio files on film analysis and psychology and so on, which are available for digital download. And these are items that are mostly not available for free on YouTube or any other platform. You have to order the items one by one according to which ones you want to watch. And the items which are available to order are available on the film analysis page and here, which is the insight page. And that page, I'll just take you quickly to that. That page contains videos and articles and some audio files on psychology. There's a ton of psychology stuff there. There's stuff on video games. There's a couple of items on art, such as the H.R. Giger artwork. There's a huge study of his work on there. So say you wanted to make some orders and you were interested in the H.R. Giger one, you click view product and you have a little read up, you check out the price, and if you like it, you say I want this, and the item jumps up in there into the corner, and you can stack items up there in the corner. Let's say you went back to my previous page and you went to the film analysis page, and say you wanted the Abyss. You click I want this, and you can see that the items are stacking up there in the corner. So let me just take you through some of the other things we got. I've got a big video on the movie AI Artificial Intelligence, which, as most of you will know, is a Kubrick and Spielberg collaboration, massively underrated film. So I've got a 147-page analysis of that film in PDF form, but it's got a whole bunch of supporting videos with it. Got lots of stuff on the Alien films, militarism in the movies of Jim Cameron, 2-hour video, stuff on The Exorcist, a 2-hour video on Eyes Wide Shut called The Cult of Eyes Wide Shut, and in that one I explore all of the various conspiracy interpretations of Eyes Wide Shut, and I assess which ones have got merit and which haven't, and give you my final conclusions on that. Let's see, as Full Metal Jacket, tons of Kubrick stuff here, a huge study on Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, Nightmare on Elm Street, 2.5-hour analysis, Predator, 2-hour 20-minute analysis, stuff on Pulp Fiction, RoboCop, Risky Business, Saving Private Ryan, Scarface, lots of stuff on The Shining, Silence of the Lambs, Starship Troopers, tons of stuff here for you to sink your teeth into. So if you're ever bored with waiting around for me to post new content, because sometimes it takes me a few weeks between projects, then just head over to the site and place a few orders. And once you've picked the items that you want, and they've stacked up in the corner there, you click pay, and you can select to use your credit card or PayPal. It's all secure. I've been using this selling system for many years now, and there's never been a problem with people's personal data being breached or anything like that. And if there's ever a difficulty with the order, you can contact me very easily. There's a short video explaining how to place the orders and a little bit of a write-up here about it as well. Okay, so if you're interested in that stuff, then head over to my website, which is collativelearning.com. And now back to the video. At the Soviet end of the Cold War situation, the motive to somehow destroy the United States was certainly there, not just the US, but all other capitalist countries. The aim of communists from the beginning has been to have worldwide revolution, so that capitalism can be destroyed everywhere and replaced with world socialist government, where we can all be equally poor and impoverished. Sorry, I mean economically liberated. This failed to materialise across Europe in the early 20th century, so the Soviets adapted what they called socialism in one country, also known as, wait for the parallel with right-wing Nazis. The Soviets adopted national communism. So we have an idiotic ideological spectrum today which most so-called intellectual political thinkers believe in, and therefore frames almost all political debate. A model which assumes that nationalism is a product of right-wingers, hence the Nazis were National Socialist. But political debate seems to overlook the word socialist in that two-worded label. And so on the far left, the Soviets were National Communists. National Socialism, National Communism, not much difference, but somehow they are perceived as left versus right. With both the Nazis and the Soviets, the nationalism element was basically the fertilization stage for the long game, the initial strengthening of their own country into a war machine as a precursor to an international revolution, expansionism. What the communists call international socialism is a concept still very popular today, especially among proponents of the European Union. Thankfully, the EU doesn't have a war machine yet, and hopefully will never get one. In fact, those captions at the beginning of Red Dawn, the script has some extra ones, and the one that reads NATO dissolves is expanded to say, quote, Japan and European Common Market sign trade agreements with Moscow, NATO dissolves, end quote. Well, guess what? The EU did sign one with Russia in 1997. However, this was after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. But getting back to my point, communists had their sights on a world takeover from the beginning, and the Soviets never lost sight of that, hence all the proxy wars with the US since the end of World War II. So with all this information, especially the leaked plans for US continuance of government in the event of a decapitating first strike, who's to say that Red Dawn's World War III premise was just a ridiculous paranoid fantasy? It's one of the most interesting and thought-provoking war movie plots I've ever come across. If the action scenes had been more realistic, then I think Red Dawn would be a serious contender for being one of the best war movies ever made, instead of just one of the most interesting. There have been lots of negative criticisms of the film in regards to the opening titles depicting the dissolve of NATO, the Green Party taking control of Germany, and various countries turning communist and thus joining the Russians so that America stands alone. But look at the various things that have happened in the world since the movie came out in 1984. Some of it has been unexpected and was, well, virtually unthinkable back then. The very swift collapse of the Soviet Union, the European Union emerging as a very different kind of threat, one that conquers countries not by military invasion but by bureaucratic corruption and bribery, and I've done my research on that, by the way. If the US was invaded, I wouldn't envision many European countries getting involved besides the UK, just as Tanner says.
What about Europe?
I guess they figured twice in 1 century was enough. They're sitting this one out. All except England. They won't last very long.
The vote for Brexit was another surprise turn of events that the world didn't expect, as was the election of Donald Trump. And how about the 2008 financial crash or the US-led invasion of Iraq? If movies had been made in 1984 that predicted all these changes to the world, then those movies would have seemed even more far-fetched than Red Dawn. Or how about the creation of the internet and all the massive change it has made to human civilization? Hardly any sci-fi movies predicted this. The future is far from predictable, and it was certainly feasible that the kinds of changes outlined at the start of Red Dawn might have happened. NATO would never collapse, the critics say. Yeah, but the League of Nations did, as did the Soviet Union, and the telltale signs are there for a near-future EU collapse as well. Or a world economic depression brought about by, of all things, a microscopic virus. But getting beyond the incidental plot and setting and onto more universal themes, Red Dawn has a strong emotional narrative about how people should be psychologically prepared in case their comfortable lifestyle is somehow shattered. Here is Justin Dell's summary of that message, with his emphasis being on war. Quote, "The salient theme running through Red Dawn is the tension that exists between the desirability of childlike innocence and the danger it poses to the one blessed with it. In effect, innocence breeds complacency and becomes the agent of its own destruction. It makes the indulgent vulnerable to their enemies, unaware of what is at stake. Only after innocence is overcome can it be regained and passed on to future generations. The generations that fought the 2 world wars and then the Cold War lost their innocence so that subsequent generations could retain theirs. Paradoxically, a generation with no knowledge of war, with its innocence intact, might not appreciate what it has. Freedom isn't free is the resounding message of Red Dawn. The cost of freedom requires the periodic sacrificing of childlike innocence at both the personal and collective level, and the cultivation of a sense of responsibility and vigilant defence of what one has." End quote. Excellent. And remember, this isn't written by some paranoid gun nut with a secret underground bunker waiting for Armageddon. These are the words of an academic working for the NATO Association of Canada, an organisation specialising in the study of international affairs and defence. The characters of Red Dawn categorically fit within this sacrificed innocence theme. Although the youngest rebel, Danny, says he's 15 in the film, and Jed, the eldest of them all, is only 20 according to the script, these 2 characters represent a generational gap. Jed's worldviews are an echo of his own father's.
I was tough on both of you. And I did things that made you hate me sometime. But you understand now, don't you? Can't afford to be crying anymore now.
You're getting pretty lean on feelings, aren't you?
Can't afford them.
And so Jed sort of represents the more cynical, wiser, realist views of previous generations who are aware of how normal life can be annihilated by sudden war, while Danny represents the youngest generation's desire to cling on to innocence, and so in the script he's only 13. He's the one who goes into the most denial about the reality of the invasion, and he's the one who most often objects to the group's rebel war against the invaders.
Are we doing right?
He's clinging on to the innocence of his youthful generation, who have no first-hand experience of the horrors of war. I don't personally think Danny is a very convincing character, and I think they chose the wrong actor, but I guess as a symbol of innocent youth it kinda works. Near the ending, Jed and Matt sacrifice themselves in a suicide mission against the enemy to create enough chaotic distraction so that Danny and Erica can escape through the mountain pass to the safe zone. one generation sacrificing itself so the next one can enjoy not just freedom but a certain amount of comfortable innocence. Of these two young survivors, Erica is the one who says she will never forget.
I'm never gonna forget. As long as I live.
And it's her who narrates that she occasionally visits the sacrificial monument of the rebels and that no one else does. Danny has nothing to say in this final scene, except...
We're free now.
There's no talk of him visiting this monument, so it seems that he managed to forget and stay innocent after all. At the same time, there's a specific tragedy in this story that's very easy to overlook. None of the dead rebels have had kids. They die childless. So in a way, they never even got to live a proper life in the first place. But they also show indications of wanting to stay kids themselves.
Please let them forget, O Lord. So they can be little again.
And Jed carrying his brother Matt to sit in the playground where they used to play as kids, wanting their mutual death to be a return to innocence. Even their dad, who says not to cry, gets choked up about this.
I used to put you on the swings, and both of you were so damn little. God.
And the Cuban officer Bella writes to his wife talking about missing his own childhood. He definitely does that in the script, and I think he does it in the film too. It's also put across in this movie with emphasis that what these rebels are going through isn't the worst that war can inflict upon people.
There's 500,000 scarecrows in Denver would give anything for one mouthful of what you got.
They live on rats and sawdust bread and sometimes on each other.
It can be a lot worse. So yeah, a hard-hitting reality message from this movie. There's always been wars of some kind, and we should never get complacent that it won't happen again. Alright, so some other positive and interesting qualities of this film. Well, right at the beginning of the movie, in the title sequence, we have a view flying through clouds along with the caption, "A Valkyrie Production." In Norse mythology, a Valkyrie is a flying war maiden who chooses which dead soldiers in the battlefield are admitted entrance to the glorious Valhalla afterlife. John Milius had also incorporated Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries into the Apocalypse Now scene of American helicopters flying in to attack a Vietnamese village. Previously, I considered this opening cloud flight in Red Dawn to be a representation of the Soviets' point of view, being that they are on their way to invade the US. But maybe this is the flight of the Valkyries who will choose from the dead in the film's story for entrance to Valhalla. The music here is a bit menacing, but it also has a glorious heavenly feel to it. The film title itself appears in blood red, yet the music gives a positive punctuation. After the titles, there's a fair bit of foreshadowing of the war story about to unfold. First, some of the protagonists debate a football game that they severely lost. I think this is a little nudge to us that when these kids become freedom fighters, they might well lose or at least die trying. The whole war is equated to a football game several times, from Matt's football tackle of a Russian soldier, to them grabbing a football as they escape from town, to playing football in between battles with the Russians, to lines such as these.
Oh, come on, bud. You lost a football game once yourself.
What? I don't remember.
I do.
I think you're lying.
This isn't the big game, Mr. Quarterback. He can go wherever he wants.
No.
You lose.
Into the school classroom, and the teacher's explanation of Genghis Khan's war tactics parallels the tactics of the Soviet invasion.
Now, the great hunt would always begin with the armies spread out in a semicircle. Now, the ends would kind of close in to form a shrinking circle. And everything within that circle panicked to get out.
They opened up the door down here. The whole Cuban and Nicaraguan armies come walking right through, roll right up here through the Great Plains. Cut the pipeline, came across Canada, a link up here in the middle, but we stopped their butt cold.
And it went on until the young son of the Khan asked his father, that the last creature alive, be allowed to go free.
And the teacher's story about the last creature alive being allowed to go free? This is what happens in the final battle. Another bit of foreshadowing that's easy to miss occurs here. Bella is told that US tanks are approaching the town that they've occupied. He orders his next in command to have Russian troops dig holes in the ground outside the city where they can hide, armed with RPGs. And that's the yellow rocket launchers that we see later in the film. He says that as the US tanks approach, the dug-in troops should launch surprise attacks to annihilate them with the RPGs. We saw in the opening attack scenes that the RPG is used by the Russian invaders, but later on the role of this weapon in the film switches hands and is only seen being used by the American freedom fighters. So I think the Cuban officer giving orders for the annihilation of US tanks by nothing more than ground troops armed with RPGs, I think that's a way of rendering plausibility to the idea that a gang of less than 10 guerrilla fighters would be able to do the same against the tanks of the invading force. To that effect, we see demolished US tanks outside the town perimeter later on, along with dug-up holes where the troops had waited with RPGs in hand. There's also a possible parallel there between the dugout holes for this assault and the rebel protagonists digging holes for their first assault. The RPG is an interesting weapon if you go read the wiki page on it. It's an anti-tank weapon, so must have some pretty powerful ammunition variants. It has been used in most wars since the 1960s apparently, and is a favourite among guerrilla and resistance fighters. It was used against the Soviet occupying forces in Afghanistan, and Red Dawn is the first movie in which I ever saw one of these weapons being used. So we have another example there of a parallel between the Wolverines and Afghan rebels fighting Soviet invaders. What's even more interesting for me is that the RPG series of weapons were designed and manufactured by the Soviet Union, thus being a small example of industrial and technological prowess by our Cold War opponents. Another example is the Soviet-designed AK-47 assault rifles and its variants such as the Kalashnikov. These are apparently the most popular assault rifles in the world. We see the Wolverines using them as well. The RPG and AK-47 weapons illustrate that Soviet ground-based warfare at the infantry level would be a hell of a force to compete with, given some of their excellent weaponry. However, when it comes to the larger weaponry such as tanks and helicopters and nuclear warfare capability, the Soviet Union tended to lag behind its free market capitalist opponents. Milius himself talks in some interviews about how the task of constructing fake versions of Soviet tanks and helicopters was made easier by the fact that the Soviets had basically created those beasts by reverse engineering similar models already manufactured in the West. And so the prop makers for the film were able to acquire the original Western model blueprints and parts for the tanks and use them as the base for building convincing portrayals of the Soviet incarnations. If you want to dig deeper into the history of how Soviet technological prowess was limited by its communist economy and therefore dependent on Western technology to advance itself, then grab a copy of Anthony Sutton's The Best Enemy Money Can Buy. This is an incredible book outlining that Western corporations effectively helped build our own communist enemy by selling and giving technology to the Soviets, who then used it against the world, even supplying the Viet Cong so that they could kill American and ARVN forces in the Vietnam War. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. So there's a military and technological interdependency between Western capitalism and the communist forces who want to destroy it. This is one of the great ironies of the Cold War, and I think it really does need wider recognition because common public perception seems to be that the communist economies are actually able to adequately compete on their own terms with capitalism. Generally, they can't. I am including China in that equation, by the way, who were known for reverse engineering and copying Western products. Actually, one of the best jokes I ever heard about communist economies was this classic moment from a Peter Sellers interview.
Comrades, smoke Bruchkins. Bruchkins are not merely the coolest, the finest, and the best cigarettes in Russia. They are the only cigarettes in Russia.
That's right, communist governments facilitate product monopolies even more than capitalism does. The lack of market competition in turn severely slows down innovation, but all of that ties back into the basic truth that capitalism versus communism is a stupid ideological debate to begin with. It's impossible for a civilization to be entirely one or the other, just as our species requires the presence of males and females. And that links nicely in with our next topic, Red Dawn's approach to sexuality. Given the Brat Pack cast, who normally would be seen in teen movies in which love and sex are key themes, it's surprising that there are no love affairs between young rebels in this film. Tony and Erica are good-looking girls, as are some of the guys, yet they are asexual in each other's presence. There's no flirting between them. Personally, I think it's good that the filmmakers avoided any romantic developments among these characters because it would offset the encompassing themes of loss and bereavement for dead family members. The script was different though. It included a third female rebel, and all three of the women in the team, they develop intimate relationships with one of the males. One of them with Jed, one with Danny, and it's he and her who are seen escaping in the final scene, and one with the crashed pilot Tanner. But Milius scrapped all of that except the relationship between Erica and Tanner. She's the one who finds him stranded and brings him back to camp. The two of them start mutually communicating through flowers. I don't quite get this, but it shows a certain intimacy that is developing between them, I guess. They flirt together here as she quizzes him about how he met his wife and whether he still loves her, basically asking if he's now available to her. And she's heartbroken at his death, like she was in love with him.
I'll never love anybody again.
There was a deleted love scene between these two characters in which, according to the script, it strongly implied that they sleep together, but test audiences reportedly disapproved of the scene because of the age difference between the characters. Isn't it interesting, though, that there's no reports of test audiences considering the movie to be right-wing propaganda? If it's true that audiences didn't like a relationship occurring between these two, then I think it's a shame that they were so judgmental about a situation in which two lonely characters caught up in the horrors and bereavement of war give each other some comfort, and it's not like she was underage anyway. Though I am glad that the scripted scene of Tanner and Erica being roasted alive together by napalm in this scene was deleted. Regardless of all the script deletions, the implication of a love affair between them is still strong in the movie, and I think a good aspect of that is it perhaps represents the bonding between generations. Erica is the one who narrates at the end of the film that she'll never forget the sacrifices made in this war, and I think that links into her love affair with an older man. Oh, by the way, as a side note, wouldn't it have been interesting if Tanner had turned out to be a Russian spy sent to infiltrate the group by having them find him in the wilderness? Aside from all that, equality-obsessed viewers of the film ought to at least approve of these two girls being presented as tough fighters and not as sex objects. They are the first ones to kill one of the enemy, and that scene is followed by this.
Don't you make yourself useful?
You wash it. You're never doing your washing again. Me and her is as good as any of you.
And Erica in particular is suggested to have been raped.
She doesn't say much, does she?
No. Something happened to him.
She utterly flips at a line from Matt that may have even triggered the rape memory.
So what's up your ass?
Shut up! Don't you ever say that again! Hear me? You say that again, I'll kill you. Hear me? I'll kill you.
This is another reason I think her relationship with Tanner is a good element of the story. If she feels she can't trust younger guys, then maybe the presence of a more sensitive, experienced, fatherly man helps her overcome that. This is true in life. Lots of young women like older men for their experience and greater sensitivity. Hey, I wonder if the big Russian guy getting shot in the arse with an arrow here was some sort of reverse rape metaphor. More about roles of women. In the script, the girl shown in the shop here is actually flirting with the Russian troops, so the boys have to go and get their information from another shop owner, a male. And another weird aspect that Milius also wisely scrapped is that Tony is made to wear sexually appealing dresses so that she can be a more effective covert operative against the commies. In doing this, the rebels give her the nickname Bait. Bait! Feminist viewers would have lost their shit over that one. But Tony does have her own moment of subtle intimacy here with Jed, and it almost plays like a love scene because that's originally what it was in the script. Jed was supposed to have a relationship with a girl called Sandy, and this scene, with the dialogue almost identical, was their farewell to each other. But Milius kept in the stroking of her hair by Jed, so I wonder if this was to suggest to us that maybe these two did have a love affair which was otherwise not shown to us. Right before she gets shot, she's flirting with Jed, squeezing orange juice onto his head. The only instance of flirting between the young male and female characters. Isn't it funny that these two would be reincarnated and reunited in the horror movie Dirty Dancing? On the racial front, I mentioned in my negative critique earlier that the character Aardvark seems to be the token non-white kid thrown into the rebel ranks, but he dies first and is the least fleshed out character. Well, the accusations of racism that have been made by some against this movie are more strongly countered on two other points. First, the parallel between the Wolverines and the Native Americans resisting colonialism. We've already gone into that in detail earlier. And second, the school teacher giving the history lesson framing of the story, he's a black guy. That could even be a sly reference to colonialism, and it's something that was added in by Milius. The script did not say he was a black guy. On the broader issue of cinematography, Red Dawn isn't a visual masterpiece, but it's efficient. The shots are chosen in a manner that mostly just serves the story, and that's fine. There are occasional very nice shots, like some of the mountain views, the odd bit of slow motion, etc. And while the cinematography may be a bit bland in places, it's not bad enough to detract from the story and its themes. Cinematographer Rick Waite also shot 48 Hours and Footloose and did an awesome job on both of them, so I think when the haters say that Red Dawn is badly shot, they're just making up excuses to diss the movie. The film is, however, much more visually impressive in terms of how Soviet vehicles are depicted. When I had a negative reaction to the film during my 2010-ish rewatch, one of the major reasons I assumed the film to be official military propaganda was because there are lots of Soviet tanks and even 3 Soviet helicopters present in assorted scenes. Seeing this stuff, I thought the only way the filmmakers would get hold of that kind of equipment is if the US military was somehow involved in the production. But apparently these vehicles were actually mocked up to look like the real thing. There's a great little YouTube video here showing how the fake tanks were pieced together. It's incredibly impressive. And those helicopters, they're French ones, which the Soviets had used as the base blueprint for theirs. So the filmmakers altered the exteriors of the French choppers, added wings, put a fake front exterior on, and darkened the windows to hide the fact that a small helicopter nose was hidden inside. What they achieved here was damned impressive, and there's little additional details that help the scene a lot, like the nice audio effect of the chopper blades bouncing around the canyon walls. And the foreshadow of Jed seeing a hawk above them as they fall for the chopper attack trap. These fake Soviet choppers are very convincing, and the shots look great because of it. They even had fake tank shells going off here through a fiberglass turret, and painted the tanks different colours for different scenes to save on costs. So even the biggest haters of this film can't deny how impressively realistic looking the vehicles are. Another excellent visual element of Red Dawn is the seasonal progress. It starts in early autumn during the onset of the invasion. As the rebels become traumatised and hardened freedom fighters, the emotional toll on them is paralleled by the seasonal change to winter. There is a visual discontinuity in that the chopper attack scene is far less snowy than it should be, but I think the orange rock faces here provide a great visual look that singles out this scene. Also, the weather difference might be due to many scenes taking place high up in the mountains. Although, jump straight ahead to the end scene, and the town itself, which isn't up in the mountains, is full of extremely dense winter snow, 40 odd below. A curious little note now on possible product placement. A Chevron logo is prominent in this idyllic shot of the town before the invasion starts. A Texaco sign further back on the right too. Various brand names are shown during the prepping scene. A Chevrolet sign extremely visible here. Coors beer signs here, along with Good Gulf, and quite a few instances of our heroes drinking Coke, but not Pepsi as far as I can tell, though there is a Pepsi sign here. All of these could just be incidental for authenticity's sake, but you never know, could be product placement. One reference that is no doubt deliberate is the Star Wars hat worn by one of the kids in the early scenes. Milius hung out a lot with Spielberg and Lucas, and they were always referencing each other's films within their own movies, so it looks like Milius got in on that. The script says that it's an E.T. hat, not a Star Wars one, and that a Russian soldier tries to buy it off him when they visit the town. Also in the script is that Russian soldiers are seen eating as, quote, a Russian flag flutters above the golden arches of McDonald's, end quote. And perhaps the weirdest product reference, the execution of prisoners here was supposed to have them hanged instead of shot, and with a sign behind them saying, quote, "Things go better with coke," end quote. If there's a meaning to that, it's slightly gone over my head. But anyway, that's all the product placement stuff out the way. A good plot detail that's very quickly thrown in but could have been expanded is the occupying force committing murders in the town and blaming them on the escaped teenagers. These kinds of cynical operations, known as false colours or false flags, are a low-down dirty tactic that gets used in many wars, sometimes by both sides of the conflict, making it hard to distinguish the good guys from the bad guys, if such terms even apply. Seeing the movie in HD, I was able to read some of the propaganda signs better. There's stuff about curfews, there's a free admission to the cinema to a 1938 movie called Alexander Nevsky. I've never seen that film, but according to Wikipedia, it was approved and used by Stalin's regime as a form of political propaganda. There's some Lenin posters, of course, and next to them a poster saying, "In America, the poor still go hungry." And yet Russians historically starved themselves after their mass persecution and murder of evil capitalist farmers. So much for common purpose. And the lack of goods in the shop here is cited in the script as, quote, "pitifully stocked shelves," end quote. Yes, that's a communist economy for you. As these soldiers burn books, a big poster, "The new man arises from the evil ashes of capitalism." He looks like a fantasy superhero in parallel with the Nazis' ideal Aryan archetype. Through the window here we can see a huge sign that says something about indoctrinating women into the communist collective. After this there's the so-called re-education camp, which includes propaganda movies being shown to the prisoners. It's hard to make out the dialogue from that propaganda movie, but there's a part about paying for the napalm burning of peasants, probably a reference to the Vietnam War. I'd love to get my hands on a copy of this little movie that's being shown here, as I don't know if it's a real communist propaganda movie or one that's been written and edited specifically to be shown in Red Dawn. Although the Soviets, according to this study, were mostly unable to create much in the way of propaganda movies because they lacked the technology and expertise to do so. That's the snail pace of communist innovation again. Meanwhile, their audience has watched a lot of imported movies from the evil capitalist West. Actually, this author cites the film Alexander Nevsky as being a movie about persuading the Russian people that they must be willing to repel any invading force. If that's true, then it mirrors the same message in Red Dawn. He also explains that Soviet propaganda movies pushed empty promises of equality for women and minorities. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? By the way, I must state for those of you who might think I'm bashing communists, the Nazis made a lot of propaganda movies too, and so has the US, and so has Britain. A lot of 50s science fiction movies seem to boil down to the fear of invasion by communists, with aliens usually standing in for the Cold War enemy. Some were downright silly, but others, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, were very good. Right, back to Red Dawn. During the scene of family and friends of the rebels being executed, we can also see nuns in the background. I assume these people are here to be executed as well, so the nuns are probably a reference to the Soviet Union's persecution of people for their religious beliefs, in which they are reported to have executed thousands of priests by firing squad, and there are reports of monks and nuns being executed in the same way. While the film doesn't get much into the boring verbal exchanges of communist versus capitalist ideology propaganda, the Wolverines are depicted as mounting a propaganda war of their own by writing their name on destroyed Russian vehicles and compounds, by blowing up a Soviet-American friendship propaganda center in this scene, and by attacking the re-education camp and writing their name in place of the Soviet propaganda film. The propaganda center includes a funny and ironic sign that says, "Friends, these things are unhealthy," and then it gives a list including typewriters, printing equipment, etc., etc. In other words, free speech is unhealthy. Another funny one here seems to show a guy imprisoned behind the bars of a flipped and rotated US flag. Later in the film we see a fictional red flag with a blue and green star in the centre. According to CRW Flags, that's the website that specialises in flag history, this is a fictional flag for the occupied zone in the movie and is probably based on an alleged unofficial Soviet army flag which had a yellow star. There's been some debate over whether that flag actually existed or not, or whether it was official. But it does look like Milius has based this occupied zone flag on that one. Okay, another obscure theme, but I think it has an emotional effect. Though religion isn't explicitly explored in the movie, apart from the Cuban guy saying at the end he wants to return to God, commies are atheists of course, there's a certain Zen spiritual vibe conveyed through the various still shots of mountains that introduce different chunks of the story, usually with the month scene and subtitles. Jed's younger brother Matt comments on this Zen spirituality.
It's kind of strange, isn't it? How the mountains pay us no attention at all. You laugh or you cry. The wind just keeps on blowing.
It seems the mountains represent eternity or even God calmly overseeing the story. When Tony dies, she talks of wanting a moment of spiritual calm, like a connection with nature or something.
I was gonna stay here and listen to the wind a while, okay?
And when Jed writes the names of the dead on a rock, including his own and his brother's, being that they've decided to go on a suicide mission, he looks to a still view of the wondrous mountains as if he's maybe looking forward to the calmness that will follow death. I suppose in a way you could say that they've already died and that they've completely lost their innocence. I mean, that was a major theme in the film anyway. And I particularly like the glittery snow or frost when Jed and Matt are about to meet their maker. This gives an almost spiritual kind of vibe to this scene, almost like Christmas tinsel. And there is one Christmas scene earlier in the movie when some of the characters visit the old couple who give them supplies from time to time. Apparently it was 40 below when they shot this end scene, and that results in the glittery ice particles in the air, so, you know, there was no CGI back then. All these underhanded spirituality details, they give a nice subtlety and contrast to the horrors of war. And of course, it's in opposition to the atheism associated with communism. For me, the most valid critique thrown at Red Dawn is that a small band of teenagers would not be able to take on a trained and well-armed invading force as we see in the film, especially going through many raids without losing a single battle and without a single casualty or injury. This certainly detracts from the film as it requires a huge suspension of disbelief. However, like with many war movies that require the same suspension of disbelief, the band of protagonists we follow in the narrative here are representative of one side of the war. In real war, many fight and die for both sides, but to be emotionally engaging, a war movie narrative needs a small group of central characters who we get to know and follow them on their journey, because to jump back and forth between thousands of characters each doing their little part and mostly dying along the way, it would be too impersonal a story. Most war movies that I've seen involve this narrative of representative protagonists. Even highly praised war movies like Platoon do it. And in the most far-fetched examples, a single character can be representative of their own nation's military, the likes of Rambo or Where Eagles Dare, and so on. At the same time, the importance of central characters is especially reflective of the human desire for individual freedom, rather than us all just being collective clones belonging to the state. And maybe that's part of the reason why communists didn't put out a hell of a lot of propaganda movies, because it involves putting emphasis on the individual. Under communism, the individual is merely a tool or a cog of the government. I do think Red Dawn could have been scripted to be more convincing by having the rebel ranks rise and fall along the way. You know, more people join the group, some people leave the group, and more consistent casualties throughout. But the centrality of a half dozen or so characters would be best being maintained within that. It also could have dragged the movie out to like a 3-hour length, so, you know, a hell of a lot of story is told in Red Dawn, so it has to cut a lot of corners to keep down to that 2-hour-ish time frame. Now, when I gave my devil's advocate harshly negative take on Red Dawn earlier in this video, it wasn't an exaggeration of the critical backlash of paranoid tunnel vision hatred that this film has received. I've cited occasional examples in this video, but one that's worth bringing to your attention specifically because it encapsulates a lot of the negative views from paid critics and then some, as well as clearly illustrating the bias and contradiction found in those reviews, is Renegade Cuts' take on the film. I'll go into specific examples from this review in a minute, but first a little bit of context. He describes the movie as right-wing propaganda, and yet his YouTube channel states that he offers a, quote, leftist perspective on politics, philosophy and culture in popular media, end quote. So his entire channel is framed by ideological propaganda in itself. The difference is that he thinks left-wing propaganda is okay and only right-wing propaganda should be ousted. Personally, I disapprove of both. As soon as somebody announces themselves as being left or right-wing, my estimation of their intellectual worth drops considerably. It's a self-contradictory political model for people who don't want to deal with the complex realities of the world. What ideologies offer is the intellectually compromising ease of a one-size-fits-all simplistic worldview. To buy into one of those simplistic ideological worldviews, you have to edit out the parts of reality that don't fit, and I'm going to go through a series of points demonstrating how this has been done in the Renegade Cut video. And so Renegade Cut cites that there are characters in the film who tell everyone not to cry and to instead turn their anger into something else. There's actually only 2 instances in the film of characters saying don't cry, and only 1 instance of turn it into something else. There's Matt and Jed's father trying to toughen them up to survive, and then Jed repeating the same to the larger group.
Can't afford to be crying anymore now. I don't want either one of you to ever cry for me again.
Don't cry. Don't you ever cry again. As long as you live. As long as you live, never do it. Do you hear me? Let it turn to something else, Manny. Let it turn.
Clearly, he's echoing his dad's sentiment, trying to be like his dad. The video author claims that this, quote, suggests emotions are good only for anger and nothing else, end quote. And then he just moves on. He totally omits that lead character Jed, who tells everyone not to cry in just one scene, actually breaks down later in the film, cries his eyes out. This is because one of his fellow rebels has murdered another one, and he becomes sentimental toward his brother in 2 scenes at the end of the movie.
I love you, Maddie.
I know. I love you too, Jen.
Hang on, man. Daddy'll be here soon, man.
How could the video author not notice this and how it contradicts with Jed saying don't cry earlier in the film? Simple, by being ideologically compromised by the ridiculous left versus right political view of the world. There's loads of crying throughout this movie from boys and girls. This film acknowledges and presents the emotional sorrow of war rather than suppressing it, and this is reflected in much of the musical score too. Renegade Cut also claims that anything anti-war that was in the original script by Kevin Reynolds was taken out by the director John Milius, but I've actually read the entire script and that is not the case at all. The moment when a communist officer points his gun at 2 of the injured rebels at the end of the movie becomes sentimental and ushers them to leave, to go free, and then he drops his gun, in other words, he no longer wants to be a soldier. The director added this scene in, and it's probably the most anti-war moment in the whole movie. He also added in the sentimental scene that follows where Jed lays on a bench with his brother in the park where they used to play as kids, the 2 of them dying. So I don't think Renegade Cut even read the script. He says that actor Powers Booth had claimed Milius removed anti-war elements of his character in the script, but having read the script myself, I think Booth was wrong. I think he misinterpreted it. The major difference for his character in the script was not that he was anti-war, but that he was inexperienced with ground battle because he was a pilot. In the script, the attack on a parked warplane is actually Tanner's objective. He's the one who wants to carry out that mission, compensating for the fact that he can't fight back in the skies. And it's done separately to the scene where they liberate the re-education camp. Renegade Cut should have checked the script instead of relying on a second-hand interpretation by just one of the cast that just happened to conveniently fit his view of John Milius. Renegade Cut then goes on to say that Red Dawn can latch onto patriotic sentiment and convert the viewer into being pro-war and being obedient to the state. Real-world examples of Red Dawn having this effect aren't given, and I've not been able to find any, so it's pure theory from someone who doesn't trust other viewers to make their own minds up about an obviously fictional movie. Everyone who watches Red Dawn knows that the war that's depicted in this movie hasn't actually happened, and they knew it when the movie came out. They knew it was only a possibility that something like this would happen. So it was obviously fiction. Renegade Cut also disapproves of Jed's simple explanation of what separates them from the invading enemy.
Charlie, what's the difference between us and them? Because we live here.
Now, plenty of people disapprove of America interfering in other countries' affairs and occupying their territory with military force, and a lot of the time I object to it as well. But to say that American civilians wouldn't be justified in violently resisting an invading force is plain hypocritical thinking. If Renegade Cut was in that situation, what would he do? Would he resist, or would he join with the invading force because they were communists? Renegade Cut even claims that the film is promoting executions because one of the group executes the character Daryl. No, the film doesn't present Daryl's execution as righteous. Jed even has to scream and force himself just to execute the Russian who he barely knows.
We live here.
The characters here argue over whether to kill Daryl. Jed tries but can't. And then the most emotionally hardened of them does it anyway. Daryl stumbles onto him and pulls his scarf down, revealing the executioner's face, as if revealing a murderer. And Jed backs away from the executioner here, and the music suggests that something horrible just happened, not something righteous. Pro-execution my arse. The script says that in a follow-up scene where Jed cries over a picture of two school kids, and this is in the movie, the picture is of Daryl and Robert, the executed and his executioner, when they were both kids. It's showing the tragedy that this war, which none of them wanted, has turned kids who were previously friends against each other. Daryl even says, "They did things to me you can't imagine."
Oh God, they did things you can't imagine.
Meaning he was tortured. When Tony is dying, she further suggests the inevitability of Daryl's interrogation.
Don't let him get me. He's gonna make me talk.
And in the original script, which had a longer dialogue scene here, they condensed it in the film, Daryl explains that he didn't have to tell the Russians where their own group were because they'd already figured it out. They had some sort of surveillance system where they managed to track them down. And Daryl didn't go to the enemy on purpose. He went to see his own father, just as Jed and Matt and Robert went to the town to see their own fathers and risked getting caught as well. They even went to the re-education camp. They could have been grabbed right outside this camp.
My father turned me in.
We could assume Daryl is lying about this, but his father looks like a sort of Nixon politician character. He seems to represent cowardly and self-interested politicians, and his sucking up to the occupying forces supports Daryl's claim. So basically, his own father turned him over to the Russians, who then tortured him. Renegade Cut also claims that Daryl represents the weak intellectual versus the superior masculine jock represented by Jed, and that this is right-wing. Actually, Jed is the leader because he's the oldest and thus the most experienced, the truck they escaped in is his, and because he knows how to survive in the mountains. But unlike the puny, weak intellectual character named Upham in the movie Saving Private Ryan, whose character arc ends with him executing a captured German soldier in a glorious manner with, patriotic music immediately after. Unlike that, Daryl in this movie is one of the tallest of the rebel group. He doesn't wear glasses. He's not really shown to be a bookworm. Sure, he's president of the student body at the school, but that's no big deal. He doesn't even have geeky looks. He is seen fighting in the battles like the others, and in one scene he is actually trying to comfort Robert after he learns of his father's death. He is comforting the very character who later executes him. And in the end titles, Daryl is still represented as one of the brave. After all, he fought in lots of battles, taking on lots of communists. Daryl's death is not framed as justifiable execution, it is framed as a tragedy of war. In fact, here his executioner Robert, tallying dead commies on his rifle, is framed as being unable to see himself for the cold murderer that he is becoming.
All that hate's gonna burn you up, kid.
Keeps me warm.
Robert misheard the line as all that heat's gonna burn you up. Great little dialogue moment. In addition to this, going against the idea that Red Dawn is a pro-execution movie is the first scene of the teenagers fighting with Russians. They don't choose this fight, but rather the Russians come to them by accident on a sort of sightseeing trip. For me, this is the best battle scene of the movie because the kids are much more clumsy in how they handle the fight. So it feels more real, and it lacks any kind of music to try and force an emotional response from us. Now, if the intention was to make Russians look evil, then having these ones try to rape one of the girls or do some other nasty deed, that would be the way to ensure that the audiences hate them and view their deaths as being justified. But these guys are just shown clowning about, enjoying the scenery, even having a sense of humour. And they're not muscular, skin-headed ruffians, which is how a lot of movies portray the enemy, like Saving Private Ryan. Rather than being bloodthirsty killers who shoot at these teenagers on sight, they fire warning shots into the air and they attempt to grab the unarmed enemy. Again, where is the supposed demonization here? One of them is imposingly tall, but after he gets shot with an arrow, he's seen trying to scramble away and shouting for help, and then he gets shot and dies. A strange distant camera shot is used during some of this fight so that we can't even see much of what's happening. I don't know if that was an error in how the film was edited, or they didn't have enough coverage for the scene, or what. I don't know, but it's a strange camera shot. And then the last of the Russians is seen struggling to get to his vehicle, with a very convincing bit of physical acting actually. And before he is executed by an angry-faced Jed, he is shown with multiple injuries, has a fairly innocent looking face, and we get to see his pain and despair in his final moments. And then the execution shot is heard off screen. This isn't pro-execution. The enemy are humanised here, and their deaths are presented in a non-glorious way. It's one of the best scenes in the film in my view, but of course Renegade Cut makes no mention of these factors in his attempts to portray the movie as pro-execution. Oh, just something else odd here. This guy who gets executed in the car, we can see the billboard in the background with the description of the forestry, which this guy misinterpreted as the description of a battle between Native Americans and colonial invaders. It's interesting that that's put very clearly into the shot here. Towards the end of his video, Renegade Cut goes on to try and persuade viewers who like Red Dawn to turn their back on the film as a piece of right-wing nationalist propaganda, as if it might infect them like a virus and lead them onto dangerous politics. But something very significant about Renegade Cut's video is that while he complains a lot about American nationalism, at no point in his review of Red Dawn does he acknowledge the documented violent genocidal history of the Soviet Union and its communist allies around the world.
So, did you do your history? Yeah, some of it.
Nor does he understand that the Soviet Union was nationalist itself. I've talked about that earlier in this video. Red Dawn is pro-defense of your country when it's invaded, but that is not the same as being pro-war as in wanting to become the invader. And John Milius already established that with Apocalypse Now. Obedience to the state is also much more intense among communists than it is among American citizens. Under communism, the state is God, the government is God. And communism in practice is just as war-orientated as capitalism, their justification being that they want to free the world from capitalist regimes through violent revolution, because they're unable to do it through democracy because people don't want to vote for it. Renegade Cut doesn't like the pro-gun ownership theme of the movie, yet he also disapproves of nationalistic obedience to the state, and there's that contradiction again. A lot of pro-gun people want their guns because they don't trust the state. Go check out Renegade Cut's video for yourself. Maybe I've misinterpreted it in places. I will say in his defence though that many years ago I too was thinking about making a video on the subject of Red Dawn as Cold War propaganda, but when I started to actually research the movie, that view turned out to hold less weight than I expected, and it was actually distracting from the film's better qualities. Red Dawn was a barrel of worms that ideology-motivated critics really didn't want to see opened. Whenever the film comes to public attention again, such as when the crappy remake showed how good the original was, the ideologists come back to try and push the lid back on and prevent Red Dawn from tapping into the truths that they don't want to hear and don't want you to hear. I've pulled back that lid here and found it contained a few worms but also many strands of truth. But I might never have done this review of Red Dawn if it hadn't been for this coronavirus that sort of sparked me into looking into prepper psychology and made me go back and look at this movie again. So that's an interesting part of all this. Has Red Dawn suddenly gained new relevance in relation to the coronavirus epidemic with regards to the issue of prepper psychology? If there is one thing I perhaps can't forgive this film for, it's for introducing Patrick Swayze and Jennifer Grey. Without this fatal introduction, we could have been spared the trauma of Dirty Dancing, a story in which I would have gladly suffered a Russian invasion. A little harsh of me, of course. That's because I'm more of a footloose man myself. By the way, regarding the late Patrick Swayze, who tragically died in his 50s, though he's known for more cheddar movies like Ghost and Dirty Dancing, he was excellent as a bad guy in the action movie Point Break. But also check out another underestimated war movie from his early career called Uncommon Valor. He doesn't have the lead role, he just has a bit part in it, but he's very good. And like Red Dawn, Uncommon Valor was very successful commercially but has been criminally underrated by critics as well. It's also directed by Ted Kotcheff straight after he had directed the awesome First Blood, so if that doesn't make you want to check it out, I don't know what will. I hope you've enjoyed this. That's Red Dawn. I haven't found any other studies of Red Dawn that go anywhere near as deep as this video has, so I really hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. If you like these kinds of videos and you want more of them, you can either go support me with a monthly contribution on Patreon, the link is in the video description there below, where you'll also find a link to the film analysis page on my website, which has all of my offline material. Those are paid items, but they're all done as digital downloads, so once you pay, you can just download them right away. If you can make a contribution, that helps a lot because these videos take a hell of a lot of time and effort and research to do. This video alone has been well over 2 weeks in production. You've been listening to Rob Ager. Adios folks, take it easy, bye bye.